The moment my girlfriend started telling me the same knock-knock joke every night at exactly 3:27 a.m. I thought she was just being playful, until I realized she was trying to warn me about something that had already replaced her. What started as an innocent bedtime routine became a desperate message from the real Ellen, trapped outside while something wearing her face shared my bed. By the time I understood the punchline, not me, so don't answer the door, it was too late to know which version of the woman I loved was real. Right at that moment when I thought I had everything figured out about love, about trust, about the person sleeping next to me every night, I had no idea that the woman I'd known my entire life was about to become a complete stranger in the most terrifying way possible. Let me tell you about Ellen, because understanding who she really was makes what happened next so much more devastating. We weren't just boyfriend and girlfriend who met at some bar or through a dating app. Ellen and I had been woven into each other's lives since we were 6 years old, running around the same neighborhood, sharing the same playground, growing up side by side like two trees planted in the same soil. I came from one of those big, chaotic families that you see in movies. 4 siblings, cousins constantly dropping by unannounced, aunts and uncles who treated our house like their second home, and parents who somehow managed to keep track of everyone's drama while still putting dinner on the table every night. Our house was never quiet, never empty, never lonely. There was always someone to talk to, always someone to help you through whatever crisis a teenager thinks is the end of the world. Ellen had none of that. Her childhood was painted in shades of silence and survival that I couldn't fully understand until we were adults. Her father was the kind of alcoholic who turned violence into a daily routine, using his fists to solve problems that existed only in his twisted mind. When he finally drank himself to death, Ellen was too young to feel anything but relief. Her mother became both parents after that, working multiple jobs to keep them afloat, showing Ellen what real strength looked like even when the world seemed determined to break them both. Ellen's mother was practically a second mom to me. She'd patch up my scraped knees when I crashed my bike in their driveway, make me sandwiches when I'd spend entire summers at their house, and listen to my teenage problems with the kind of patience my own overwhelmed parents sometimes couldn't manage. When she passed away last year after a brutal fight with cancer, it didn't just break Ellen's heart. It shattered mine too, because she was the closest thing to family Ellen had left in this world. That's what made our relationship so precious and so fragile at the same time. Ellen didn't just love me, she needed me in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying. I was her anchor, her safe harbor, her entire support system wrapped up in one person. We'd been talking about marriage, about the kids we'd have, about building the kind of family she'd never experienced but always dreamed of creating. But the tragedy had not stopped yet. In fact, the first crack in our perfect world appeared on what should have been just another ordinary Tuesday night, disguised as something so innocent that I almost convinced myself it was just a weird dream. I was deep in sleep when I first heard her voice, soft and close to my ear, cutting through whatever dream I'd been having like a gentle knife. Knock, 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 knock. The words floated into my consciousness slowly, and I felt the familiar sensation of Ellen's fingers running through my hair, that soothing gesture she'd done 1,000 times before when one of us couldn't sleep. My eyes opened gradually, adjusting to the darkness of our bedroom. Ellen was sitting up in bed beside me, looking down at me with what seemed like her usual loving expression. But something felt different, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way she was sitting so perfectly still, or how her gaze seemed more intense than usual, but a tiny warning bell went off somewhere in the back of my mind. "Hey, what is it, baby?" I mumbled, my voice thick with sleep. I glanced at the digital clock on our dresser, its red numbers glowing like angry eyes in the darkness. 3:27 a.m. I had to be at work in just a few hours, and my boss had already been on everyone's case about productivity lately. Ellen didn't answer my question. Instead, she repeated those same words, her voice carrying a strange, almost sing-song quality that I'd never heard from her before. Knock, knock. Knock, knock. She paused, and that fixed stare never wavered from my face. "Please answer the joke, dear. Knock, 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 knock." The whole situation felt surreal, like I was still half dreaming. But Ellen wasn't usually the type to wake me up for games in the middle of the night. She was always considerate about my sleep, knowing how grumpy I got when I was tired. But maybe she was having trouble sleeping. Maybe she needed some kind of comfort or distraction. We all have our weird moments, right? Fine, I said, playing along because I loved her and figured this was just some random quirky moment that would make a funny story later. "Who's there?" The smile that spread across Ellen's face was radiant, like I'd just given her the most wonderful gift in the world. But when she spoke, her words made absolutely no sense. Not me. So don't answer the door. I stared at her, completely baffled. Was that supposed to be the punchline? What kind of knock-knock joke was that? It didn't follow any logical structure, didn't have any humor that I could detect, and honestly, it sounded more like a riddle or a warning than a joke. But before I could ask her to explain what she meant, Ellen was already lying back down, pulling the blanket over herself with a satisfied sigh. Is that it? Is that the joke? I asked. But she was already settling into what looked like peaceful sleep. Yes, she murmured drowsily. Thank you for answering. I shook my head, calling her a weirdo in the most affectionate way possible, and closed my eyes. But as I drifted back towards sleep, those words kept echoing in my mind. Not me. So don't answer the door. What was that supposed to mean? Little did I know that Ellen had just delivered the most important warning of my life, disguised as an innocent bedtime joke that would soon become my nightly nightmare. No one expected that innocent moment to become the foundation of something much darker, because the next morning Ellen acted completely normal, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the whole strange encounter until it happened again and again, with terrifying precision. When I woke up the next day, I almost convinced myself it had been a dream. Ellen was her usual self, humming softly while she made coffee, reading snippets from a fashion magazine out loud during breakfast like she always did. But when I casually brought up the weird middle-of-the-night conversation, something shifted in her expression. For just a moment, that same intense stare from the night before flickered across her face, accompanied by the briefest hint of that strange smile. It wasn't anything important, she said, then immediately changed the subject when I pressed for more details. That should have been my first real warning sign. Ellen and I talked about everything, our weird dreams, our random thoughts, our most embarrassing moments. We didn't have secrets, we didn't brush each other off. But suddenly she was acting like this topic was completely off limits, which made no sense for something she claimed wasn't important. The second night, I was almost expecting it when I heard her voice cutting through my sleep at exactly 3:27 a.m. Not 3:26, not 3:28, but precisely 3:27, as if she had some internal alarm clock programmed to the minute. Knock, knock, knock. This time she wasn't touching me, wasn't even looking at me with that loving expression. She was just sitting there in the darkness, staring at me with eyes that seemed larger somehow, blinking in these slow, deliberate intervals that made her look less human and more like something trying to imitate human behavior. Ellen, come on, I said, frustration creeping into my voice. What are you doing? I've got work in a few hours. I can't have the luxury of waking up in the middle of the night to answer knock-knock jokes. But she just kept repeating those same words. Knock, 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 like a broken record that couldn't move past the same groove. The mechanical repetition was starting to unnerve me in ways I couldn't fully explain. This wasn't playful Ellen being silly or affectionate Ellen trying to connect with me. This was something else entirely. Something that looked like my girlfriend but felt completely foreign. When I finally gave in and answered, "Who's there?" Just to make it stop, she delivered the same nonsensical punchline. Not me. So don't answer the door. By the third night, I was dreading bedtime. I'd barely slept the previous night, kept awake by a growing sense of unease that I couldn't shake. When 3:27 a.m. arrived like clockwork, and Ellen began her ritual again, I tried a different approach. I pretended to be asleep, regulating my breathing and keeping my eyes closed, hoping she'd give up and let me rest. But Ellen didn't stop. She kept repeating, knock, knock over and over, her voice never changing in tone or volume, never showing any sign that she cared whether I was responding or not. It was like listening to a machine that had been programmed to repeat the same phrase until it received the correct input. The relentless repetition drove into my skull like a drill, and after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I finally cracked. That's when I saw something in Ellen's face that made my blood run cold and realized that whatever was happening to the woman I loved was far more serious than just a weird phase or sleep disorder. Right at that moment when I finally snapped and sat up in bed, ready to have a serious discussion about what was happening to our relationship, I came face to face with something that made every horror movie I'd ever seen look like a children's cartoon in comparison. God damn it. Ellen, I said, jerking upright with all the frustration and sleep deprivation of the past 3 nights boiling over. But the words died in my throat the instant I actually looked at her, because what I saw sitting beside me in our bed wasn't the woman I'd been living with for 3 years. Ellen wasn't smiling anymore. She wasn't blinking. She was just staring at me with this 1,000-yard stare that seemed to look right through me like I was made of glass. Her eyes were completely fixed on mine, unmoving, unblinking, with the kind of predatory focus you see in wild animals right before they strike. But the most disturbing part was her mouth, which kept moving in these slow, deliberate motions as the words knock, knock continued to spill out in that same mechanical rhythm. It was like watching a mannequin that had been programmed to speak but hadn't been taught how to be human. Every instinct in my body was screaming danger, telling me to run, to get away from whatever this thing was that looked like Ellen but clearly wasn't her anymore. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and I felt this primal terror that went deeper than rational thought. Knock, knock, she continued, never breaking eye contact, never showing any sign that she recognized my fear or even acknowledged my presence as a real person. The words came out weak and raspy now, like her voice was being controlled by something that didn't quite understand how vocal cords were supposed to work. "Who's there?" I whispered, because it felt like the only way to make this nightmare end. Like some kind of supernatural contract that had to be fulfilled before she would release me from this horrible moment. "Not me. So don't answer the door," she said. And then something even more unsettling happened. Ellen's eyes slowly closed, her head tilted to the side, and she laid down as if someone had just flipped an off switch. Within seconds, she was breathing deeply, apparently in a peaceful sleep that seemed completely at odds with the terrifying behavior I'd just witnessed. I sat there in the darkness, trembling and trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't Ellen having a weird moment or going through some kind of stress-related episode. This was something fundamentally wrong, something that had taken over the person I loved and was wearing her like a costume. I couldn't stay in that room for another second. I got up, walked downstairs to our living room, and spent the rest of the night on the couch, staring out the window at the quiet neighborhood and trying to convince myself that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of sleep disorder. Maybe she was sleepwalking. Maybe the stress of her mother's death had finally caught up with her in some unexpected way. But deep down, I knew this wasn't medical. This was something else entirely, something that made me too terrified to sleep in the same room as the woman I'd planned to marry. What I didn't realize was that Ellen had been trying to warn me all along, and I was about to discover exactly what she'd been so desperately afraid of. For 3 years, we'd been living together in perfect harmony. We liked the same terrible movies, laughed at each other's stupid jokes, and had developed this incredible ability to read each other's moods without saying a word. I used to pride myself on knowing Ellen better than I knew myself. I could tell when she was sad just by the way she stirred her coffee, could predict her reactions to things before she even knew how she felt about them. But that intimate knowledge, that absolute trust in my ability to understand the person I loved most in the world, was about to become the very thing that would make the next 4 nights the most horrifying experience of my life. But the tragedy had not stopped yet. In fact, the most horrifying revelation was still waiting for me on the 4th night, when I would finally understand what Ellen's cryptic warning had been trying to tell me all along. I made the decision to sleep on the couch that final night, hoping that maybe physical distance would break whatever spell or compulsion was driving Ellen to wake me up with that same terrifying routine. I convinced myself that if she had to come downstairs to find me, maybe the extra effort would snap her out of whatever trance she'd been falling into at exactly 3:27 a.m. I was deep in a dreamless sleep when something pulled me back to consciousness. Not a sound, but a feeling, that prickling sensation you get when you know someone is watching you. My eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the darkness of the living room, and what I saw made every muscle in my body freeze with pure terror. Ellen was standing right above me, maybe 2 feet from the couch, staring down at me with those same lifeless, unblinking eyes I'd seen the night before. But this time was different. This time, her pupils were completely dilated, like black holes in the middle of her face, and her expression was so utterly neutral that she looked more like a statue than a living person. She was just standing there, watching me sleep, and I had no idea how long she'd been there. I nearly screamed as I scrambled off the couch, putting as much distance between us as possible. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. And Ellen's eyes followed my every movement with that horrible, predatory tracking. The digital clock above our kitchen table read 3:27 a.m., just like every other night, and Ellen just stood there in complete silence, not saying the knock-knock joke, not moving, just watching me with those inhuman eyes. Then I heard it, a sound that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Someone was knocking on our front door. The knocking was urgent, desperate, the kind of pounding you hear when someone is in serious trouble and needs help immediately. I instinctively looked toward the door, and then back at Ellen, who was still standing motionless by the couch, that terrible wide grin slowly spreading across her face like a crack in a porcelain mask. "Who's there?" I shouted toward the door, my voice shaking with fear and confusion. The knocking stopped, and then I heard a voice that made the entire world shift beneath my feet. It was Ellen's voice, but it was coming from outside, from the other side of our front door. "John? John? Can you hear me? Open the door, please. John, please open the door." The voice was desperate, panicked, filled with the kind of terror that only comes from facing something truly horrible. I turned to look at the Ellen standing in my living room, and she was smiling wider now, showing teeth that seemed too white and too sharp in the darkness. "I beg you, John, open the door, it's serious. She's not me, I swear. She's not me." The voice outside was sobbing now, pleading with a desperation that cut straight through my heart. And that's when I finally understood the knock-knock joke. Knock, knock. Who's there? Not me. So don't answer the door. Ellen had been trying to warn me that something else was coming, something that would pretend to be her, something that I shouldn't let inside. But if that was true, then which Ellen was real? The one standing in my house with that horrifying smile, or the one outside begging me to save her? No one expected what happened next, because standing there in that impossible moment, faced with two versions of the woman I loved, my mind simply couldn't process the reality of what I was seeing and hearing, and that's where my memory stops completely. I stood frozen in that living room, caught between two Ellens, and the last thing I remember is the sound of my own heartbeat drowning out everything else. The Ellen inside was grinning at me with that horrifying expression that belonged in a nightmare, while the Ellen outside was sobbing and begging me to trust her, to save her from whatever had taken her place. I remember reaching toward the door handle, my hand shaking so violently I could barely control it, but then everything just goes black. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in our bedroom at 4:21 a.m., completely alone and trembling so hard that the entire bed was shaking. My mind felt like it had been wiped clean, like someone had taken an eraser to the most crucial moments of my life and left nothing but terrifying fragments. I had no memory of what choice I'd made. No recollection of whether I'd opened that door or left it locked. No idea which Ellen had been real and which had been the imposter. But I was alive, and I was alone, and that had to mean something, right? The silence in our house felt different now, heavier and more oppressive than any quiet I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a sleeping home. It was the kind of silence that comes after something terrible has happened, when even the air itself seems to be holding its breath. I tried to call out Ellen's name, but my voice cracked and died in my throat before I could make a sound. I needed to call someone, needed to get help, needed to figure out what had happened during those missing hours. But my phone was downstairs, sitting on the kitchen counter where I'd left it before going to sleep on the couch. And the thought of going downstairs, of walking through that same living room where I'd faced an impossible choice, filled me with a paralyzing dread that made my chest feel tight and my breathing shallow. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from somewhere below me, like fingernails slowly dragging across wood, or something with claws trying to find purchase on a smooth surface. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like a code being tapped out in the darkness. It would start, stop for a few seconds, then start again, as if whatever was making it was trying to communicate something. I grabbed Ellen's laptop from her side of the bed, my hand still shaking as I opened it and began typing this desperate plea for help. Because I'm trapped up here in our bedroom, too terrified to go downstairs and face whatever is making that scratching sound, too scared to find out if I made the right choice or if I let something unspeakable into our home. The scratching is getting louder now, more insistent, and I can hear what sounds like footsteps moving around our living room. Slow, deliberate steps that stop right at the bottom of our staircase, as if something is deciding whether or not to come upstairs. I still don't know which Ellen was real, and I'm starting to think that maybe the most terrifying possibility is that I'm about to find out. Right at that moment when I thought I couldn't take another second of that scratching sound, everything went silent, and then I heard footsteps slowly climbing the stairs. Asterisk. Each step creaked with deliberate weight, like whoever was climbing knew exactly which boards would make the most sound. I clutched Ellen's laptop tighter, my fingers frozen over the keyboard as I listened to the methodical approach. One step. Pause. Another step. Pause. It was taking forever, as if whatever was coming up wanted me to hear every single moment of its approach. The footsteps stopped right outside our bedroom door. I held my breath, staring at that door handle in the darkness, waiting for it to turn. But instead, I heard a soft voice, barely above a whisper. "John, are you awake?" It was Ellen's voice, but which Ellen? The gentle, caring tone sounded like my Ellen, the real Ellen I'd known and loved for years. But I'd heard that same voice screaming desperately from outside our front door just hours ago. "I'm sorry I scared you." The voice continued through the door. "I know this has all been very confusing, but I need you to understand something important." The knock-knock joke wasn't a warning about something coming to replace me. My blood turned to ice. It was a warning about something that had already happened. 3 nights ago, when you thought you were talking to me for the first time, you weren't. I've been trying to get back inside our house for days, John. I've been trapped outside, watching through the windows as something else lived my life, slept in my bed, touched you with my face. The door handle began to turn slowly. "The real Ellen has been knocking this whole time, John, and you finally answered the door." As the door opened and a figure stepped into the darkness of our bedroom, I realized with dawning horror that I would never know for certain which choice I had made in those missing hours. Had I let the real Ellen back inside? Or had the thing wearing her face finally found a way to convince me to open the door? The figure moved closer to the bed, and in the faint light from the laptop screen, I saw Ellen's familiar smile. "Thank you for letting me back in," she whispered, and her eyes reflected the light like an animal's a 40M. The scratching sound I'd been hearing wasn't coming from downstairs at all. It had been coming from inside the walls, where something had been clawing its way out. Asterisk. As Ellen climbed into bed beside me, I noticed that her fingernails were torn and bloody, and there were splinters of wood embedded under them. But it was too late to run, too late to scream, too late to realize that some doors should never be opened, no matter who's knocking. The last thing I remember typing was, "If anyone finds this, don't trust the knock-knock jokes. And whatever you do, don't answer the door." The laptop was found 3 days later, still open, the cursor blinking after those final words. The house was empty. Both John and Ellen had vanished completely, leaving only scratch marks on the inside of every door and window, as if something had been desperately trying to get out. Trust your instincts when someone you love starts acting strange. Those harmless quirks might be desperate warnings from the real person trapped somewhere you can't see. Sometimes the people closest to us are trying to save us from something wearing their face. The most terrifying monsters aren't strangers in dark alleys. They're the familiar faces that smile back at us from our own mirrors, hiding something unthinkable behind eyes we thought we knew. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button to help others find it. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. And subscribe to join our community of resilient souls who've learned that sometimes being underestimated is your greatest superpower. Together, we're writing new endings to old stories, and I can't wait to share the next chapter with you.